The field had been dead for 2 years. Sable knew this because she had been listening to it die, one frequency at a time, one drained root system at a time. One silenced earthworm colony, and one dried underground channel, and one collapsed fungal network at a time, from across the border where she was kept. Close enough to hear, and too far to do anything except map what she heard and wait. She was done waiting. She stood at the edge of the withered field in the gray pre-dawn light, her boots removed. Her bare feet pressed flat to the cracked earth, her hands open at her sides. The Vethmark border guards stood 30 paces behind her with the specific discomfort of men watching something they could not categorize, not dangerous, not permitted, not anything their training had prepared them for. She had told them she needed air. She had walked to this field because this field sat directly above the largest drain point in her map. The one she had been circling toward for 6 weeks, the one that sang its harrowing low, sustained note of agony so loudly that it had been waking her at 3 a.m. with her hands pressed flat to the floorboards of her assigned room. Trying to locate it, trying to understand its depth. She understood it now. She could feel it through the soles of her feet, a pulling, a wrongness. A sound below sound that was not drought and had never been drought. The specific harmonic signature of land, having its life force extracted by human hands and human intention, and a buried network of ritual conduits that ran beneath this field like roots made of absence. She lifted her palms. She pressed them to the earth. The sound hit her like grief. She stayed in it for a full minute. She mapped the signature. She named it, the 7th mage, the one she had been trying to identify, the one whose frequency had been eluding her because he ran his conduit deeper than the others, closer to bedrock, as though he understood that depth was a kind of hiding. She found him. She stood up. She looked at the dead field stretching to the horizon in the gray morning light, and she said, to no one who would believe her, in a voice that was very quiet and very certain, "It is not drought. Someone is doing this deliberately." The border guards exchanged a glance. She picked up her boots and walked back toward the estate. She had everything she needed. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. The room they had given her was adequate. This was the word Sable had settled on after the first month. When she had finished cataloging its dimensions and contents, and had arrived at an honest assessment that required neither gratitude nor complaint. Adequate. A bed that was neither too narrow nor particularly wide. A window that faced east and received the morning light at an angle that suggested the architect had been thinking about ventilation rather than beauty. A writing desk that wobbled on its left rear leg unless you placed a folded piece of cloth beneath it, which she had done on the 3rd day. A fireplace that drew well. A lock on the door that was turned from the outside each night and unlocked each morning by a household staff member who had never once, in 2 years, varied the time of their arrival by more than 4 minutes. Adequate. She had learned to build a life inside adequate. She had learned this the way she had learned most things, not because someone taught her but because the alternative was to stop building entirely. And that was not something Sable of House Veneth had ever been constitutionally capable of. Duke Haren's household was a large, efficiently run establishment in the western edge of the Vethmark Duchy, 3 days' ride from the Five Rivers border. Set on a low hill above a town whose primary industry was textile manufacture and whose secondary industry was, as far as Sable could determine, minding the business of the ducal household. The Duke himself was not a cruel man. He was a transactional one, a distinction that had seemed important in the first weeks and had gradually become less so. Because the practical experience of being a transaction was largely the same regardless of the transaction's emotional temperature. She was housed, fed, permitted to walk the grounds between certain hours, and otherwise ignored with the complete and comprehensive indifference of someone who had received a diplomatic parcel and was storing it carefully until it was required for some future exchange. She had decided to be useful while she waited. Her days had a structure that she had constructed herself because no one else had constructed it for her. She rose early, before the household stirred, and sat at the wobbly desk with the papers she had been carefully accumulating, requisitioned from the household supply stores under the polite fiction that she was writing letters, which she was not. She was building a map, not with cartographer's tools or formal survey data, but with the information her Earthsong gift provided each day during her permitted garden walks. Stored in her memory with the precise fidelity that the gift had always given her. Translated into marks on paper with a system of notation she had developed herself over the first 6 months, because no existing notation system was designed to record the specific information she was recording. The walks were the center of everything. She had 45 minutes each morning and 45 minutes each afternoon. Always accompanied by a household guard who walked 3 paces behind her and had explicit instructions about the boundary of the permitted area. She had spent the first 3 months walking the permitted area thoroughly, mapping every frequency she could detect from inside it. She had spent the next 3 months finding the precise locations along the boundary wall where the acoustic properties of the underlying geology allowed her to hear furthest. She had spent the year since then systematically listening at those locations and extending her map outward, drain point by drain point, mage signature by mage signature, building the complete picture 1 45-minute increment at a time. It was slow work. It was the most important work she had ever done. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before she completed the map. It came addressed to Duke Heron in the official sealed envelope of the 5 Rivers Kingdoms Royal Land Commission, a body that had been convened 18 months ago to investigate what the court was calling an unprecedented natural drought event affecting the kingdom's central agricultural regions. Sable knew about the commission. She had been tracking its quarterly reports through the fragments of court correspondence that circulated through the ducal household's administrative mail, reading whatever she could access through whatever means presented themselves. Because understanding what the court believed about the drought was as important as understanding the drought itself. She did not see this letter directly. She heard it read aloud through the door of Duke Heron's study. Because the door had a gap of 3/4 of an inch at its base, and the Duke had a habit of conducting administrative business in a carrying voice. The Commission's conclusion, after 18 months of investigation, natural causes. Extended atmospheric drought cycle consistent with historical precedent. Continued monitoring recommended. Sable pressed her hand to the wall beside the study door. 3 feet below the foundation stone, clear and unmistakable as a voice she knew by name. The 7th mage's conduit sang its harrowing, pulling note of deliberate destruction. She went back to her room. She sat at the wobbly desk. She had 3 weeks of mapping left. She worked through the afternoon and into the evening, and when the lock turned on her door at nightfall she was still working, bent over her paper in the firelight, building the document that would tell the truth the Commission had spent 18 months failing to find. She was not angry. She was focused. There was a difference, and it mattered, and she had spent 2 years learning to hold it. The hill had taken her 4 months to reach. Not because it was far, it was visible from the eastern boundary wall of the permitted garden area. A low rocky rise perhaps half a mile beyond the estate's outer fence, crowned with a shelf of exposed granite that jutted from the hillside like a thought interrupting a sentence. She had been looking at it since the 3rd week of her captivity, understanding from the moment she saw it what it would offer: elevation, exposed bedrock, direct contact with the geological substrate that carried the land's deepest frequencies without the interference of topsoil and root systems and the complicated acoustic clutter of the surface world. From that granite shelf, with her palms flat and her gift fully open, she would be able to hear further and deeper than from any point she had yet accessed. The 4 months had been spent getting permission to reach it. She had done this with the patient, incremental methodology that had characterized everything she had accomplished in Vethmark, not by asking directly, which would have drawn attention to the hill's specific value, but by gradually extending the range of her morning walks through a series of small, reasonable requests, each one building on the last, each one framed in terms of health and fresh air and the psychological requirements of extended diplomatic residence. The household physician, a mild beta man who had twice prescribed her sedatives for what he called auditory disturbances and who still felt slightly guilty about her refusal of them, had been a useful advocate. The guard assigned to her afternoon walks had been amenable to gradual route extensions once she had established that she was not a flight risk, which she had done by being scrupulously, visibly not a flight risk for 14 months. She reached the granite shelf on a Wednesday morning in early autumn. She sat on the stone and removed her boots and pressed both palms flat to the exposed granite surface and closed her eyes and opened her gift completely for the first time since she had arrived in Vethmark. The sound was enormous. She had been working in careful, constrained increments for so long, listening at the boundary wall through whatever acoustic window the geology provided, filtering the information down to what she could reach and process within her supervised window, that she had almost forgotten what full Earthsong felt like. Now it poured through her palms and up her arms and into her chest like a river finding its original channel. The land's complete harmonic field opening around her in all directions simultaneously. Layer below layer, each frequency a different depth and quality of information. The healthy sounds came first. Deep underground water, moving through limestone channels 40 feet below the hill's base, a clear, low, sustained note like a cello playing in an empty cathedral, clean and round and full. The slow breathing of dormant fungal networks in the soil below the estate's garden, a subtler frequency, almost rhythmic, like something sleeping with great contentment. The distant geological heartbeat of the bedrock itself, so low it was more felt than heard, a frequency she had known since childhood. The sound she thought of as the land's true voice speaking underneath everything else it said. Then the damaged sounds. They came from the southwest, from the direction of the Five Rivers border. And they were wrong in the specific way that she had spent 2 years cataloging and had never fully grown accustomed to. Because wrongness was not something a person grew accustomed to when they could hear it this clearly. The drain points presented as gaps in the harmonic field, not silence, which would have been neutral but negative sound, a pulling inversion of the frequencies that should have been there. The acoustic signature of absence made active and intentional. 7 distinct gaps. 7 distinct pulling signatures, each one with the individual quality she had learned to read as a mage's operational fingerprint. She held each one in her attention and listened to its specific character. The first was broad and shallow, a large surface area, moderate depth, the signature of someone prioritizing coverage over intensity. She had named this one the cartographer, because the drain pattern suggested methodical survey work rather than targeted extraction. The second was narrow and very deep, running down to bedrock, extracting the geological frequency itself. The third and fourth ran in parallel at the same depth, coordinated, the work of 2 mages operating in deliberate concert. The fifth had a frantic, irregular quality, as though its operator was less skilled than the others or less careful. The sixth was the oldest. She could tell by the way the surrounding land had shaped itself around the conduit's presence. The damage accreted in slow layers over what her gift suggested was considerably more than 2 years. Someone had started earlier than the others. Someone had been planning this for a long time. The seventh was the deepest, the one she had been hunting. She found it now from the hilltop with a clarity that the boundary wall had never permitted, a cold, precise, extraordinarily controlled frequency running down to a depth that should have been inaccessible, drawing on something so fundamental in the land's structure that its extraction was not merely killing crops and drying rivers, but was slowly, deliberately, undermining the geological coherence of the entire region. Given enough time, she understood now with a clarity that was almost physical in its impact. This conduit alone would render the Five Rivers Kingdom's central agricultural basin permanently uninhabitable. Given enough time. She did not have enough time to simply map and wait. She held all 7 signatures simultaneously for a full 2 minutes, fixing them in her memory with the permanent, precise fidelity of her gift, noting depths and locations and the directional vectors that allowed her to triangulate positions with the accuracy of a surveyor. She opened her eyes. The grass of the hillside around the granite shelf had turned brown. Not withered, not drought-stressed or nutrient-depleted. Brown in the specific way of grass that has been in the presence of something that drew all the available energy toward it. The land had responded to the depth of her listening the way a wound responded to a probing examination, the distress made more visible by the attention, the damage surfacing as she had pulled it into focus. She sat on the gray granite in the middle of the brown circle and looked at it. She had her map. Every drain point, every mage signature, every depth and location and operational pattern. She had the name of the oldest conduit, which she was now certain predated the current operation, and suggested a level of premeditation that the Five Rivers Quartz Drought Commission was going to find very difficult to continue calling natural. She put her boots back on. She looked toward the southwest, toward the border, toward the dying kingdom she had been traded away from like an entry in a ledger. She thought about the farmer who would abandon his fields this season, about the family who would leave their river town because the water had gone bad, about the children who would grow up in a kingdom that had been quietly murdered while its court discussed rainfall patterns. She was done mapping. It was time to be heard. 2 years earlier, the palace receiving hall had smelled of beeswax and cold stone. Sable remembered this detail with the specific clarity that the mind reserved for moments of significant event, the way certain sensory information embedded itself permanently, as though the body understood before the conscious mind did that this was a moment worth keeping in exact, unedited form. Beeswax and cold stone, and the particular quality of winter light coming through the hall's high windows at a low angle, falling across the polished floor in pale rectangles that looked like doors laid flat. She had been standing in the hall for 40 minutes. There were 3 of them, 3 Omega candidates selected by the palace's administrative office for the Vethmark hostage arrangement, chosen according to a set of criteria that the administrator had explained in the brief. Efficient language of someone accustomed to processing transactions, designation, rank sufficiency for diplomatic validity, absence of critical palace function, family connections insufficient to create political complications upon removal. Sable had met all 4 criteria. She had understood this when she was summoned. She had stood in the receiving hall for 40 minutes and held herself with the straight-backed, quiet dignity of a woman who had decided that whatever was about to happen to her, it would not happen to a version of herself that had already collapsed. The other 2 candidates were released before Aldren arrived. She did not know why. She had never been told. The administrator had simply come to the hall, spoken briefly with his assistant, and the other 2 women had been escorted out through the side door with the efficient invisibility of people whose participation in an event had concluded. Sable had remained. She had understood, from the administrator's subsequent arrangement of the remaining documentation and his positioning of himself at the hall's formal reception point, that her participation had not concluded. She was the one being sent. King Aldren entered the hall 12 minutes later. She had seen him before, at formal court events she had attended as a minor noble's daughter, distant. Ceremonial glimpses of a man who occupied the center of every room. He entered with the particular gravity of someone who had been trained to understand that rooms organized themselves around power, and who had never been given reason to question whether that was the correct way for rooms to behave. He was taller than she had registered from a distance. He moved through the receiving hall with the focused efficiency of someone who had a great deal to do and had allocated a specific and limited portion of it to this task. He went directly to the administrator. He took the documentation. He read it, quickly, thoroughly, with the practiced speed of a man accustomed to processing large volumes of administrative material. Sable watched him read. She watched his eyes move across the pages. She watched him reach the relevant sections. The sections that contain the terms of the arrangement and the specifications of the hostage candidate selected. And she watched his expression remain entirely neutral throughout. The professional neutrality of competent administration. And she felt something inside her chest go very quiet. Not break. She wanted to be accurate about this, even in memory, even in the privacy of her own understanding. Not break. Simply go quiet. In the way that something went quiet when it finally received the confirmation of something it had been hoping was not true. He did not look up. He signed. He returned the documentation to the administrator, said 2 words that she was not close enough to hear, and walked back through the hall the way he had entered, with purpose, with focus, with the complete, unperformed, entirely genuine absence of awareness that a person was standing 12 feet from him who had a name and a gift and a mother who had told her she would one day be needed by the very land she was being removed from. He walked out. The administrator turned to her. He said, "You will be ready to depart at first light tomorrow. The arrangements have been completed." She said, "What is the duration?" He said, "The treaty term is open-ended, subject to review upon diplomatic developments." She had known this. She had known it going in. She said nothing further. She nodded and turned toward the door. In the short corridor outside the receiving hall, she stopped walking for a moment. Just a moment. She pressed one hand flat to the stone wall and felt the palace's deep frequency, the healthy, complex, living hum of the Five Rivers Kingdom's land in full health. Its underground rivers and its root networks and its geological heartbeat. All the things she had spent her entire life hearing without being asked and without being thanked for hearing. She felt a thin thread of something wrong in it, even then. Something small and buried and deliberate, just beginning. She thought about her mother, who had held her hands when she was 6 years old and heard her describe the sound the river made and had not told her she was imagining it. Who had said, "The land speaks to the ones who will speak for it. You are one of those ones. Hold that carefully." She had held it carefully. She would keep holding it. She removed her hand from the wall. She walked to her room. She packed what she was permitted to bring, which was not much, and she did not sleep. And in the morning she departed for Vethmark in a sealed carriage with 2 guards and no farewell from anyone in particular. In the palace receiving hall behind her, on the document the administrator had filed in the appropriate archive, her name appeared once. In the final line. Added after the king's signature. In someone else's handwriting. She left on a Thursday. Not because Thursday held any particular significance in her planning, but because Thursday was the day the estate's weekly supply delivery arrived from the border market town, and the delivery created a specific, reliable window of altered routine. The household staff redistributed to receiving and storage. The gate guard rotated 20 minutes later than usual. The outer fence's eastern latch left unbolted for the delivery cart's passage, and not rebolted until the cart had been unloaded and released, which took approximately 40 minutes depending on the size of the order. She had been observing this window for 11 months. She rose at 4 in the morning, dressed in the warmest practical clothes she possessed, and packed into a single canvas bag the items she had been assembling for 3 weeks, provisions for 7 days, a water skin, her map rolled in oilskin and secured with 3 separate ties, a small knife for practical rather than defensive purposes, a compass borrowed from the household's garden shed during a morning walk and not returned, and the folded piece of cloth that had been keeping the desk leg steady for 2 years, which she took because it was hers in the only way that anything in that room was hers, which was through the intimacy of daily use. She did not take the sedatives. She had never taken the sedatives. She walked out of the estate through the eastern gate at 17 minutes past the guard rotation, across the unfamiliar open ground beyond the fence line, with the particular focused calm of someone who has rehearsed a thing so many times in their mind that the body performs it without requiring instruction, and into the pre-dawn dark of the road that ran southwest toward the Five Rivers border. It was 40 miles. She walked. The first 20 miles were Vethmark land, and the Vethmark land was stressed but not dying. The drain network ran beneath it, but drew its primary extraction from the Five Rivers side of the border, using Vethmark's geology as a conduit rather than a source. The way a pipe used the ground it ran through without consuming it. She could hear this distinction clearly as she walked. The Vethmark frequencies muted and burdened, but fundamentally intact. The sound of land carrying a weight rather than being emptied. She tracked her position against her internal map by the frequency changes beneath her feet. Each drain point a landmark she passed as precisely as a signpost, knowing her location and her progress by what she heard. She crossed the border at dawn. The moment her feet touched Five Rivers soil, the Earthsong changed so completely and so suddenly that she stopped walking. She had been hearing the Five Rivers Kingdom from across the border for 2 years. She had built her entire map from that distance, from the filtered, attenuated version of the damage that reached her through the geological substrate, and she had understood intellectually that hearing it from inside would be different, would be more immediate, would carry more detail and more urgency. She had not understood that it would feel like walking into someone's grief. The sound hit her in a wave, not the focused, precise drain signatures she had been tracking, but something larger and more diffuse. The aggregate distress of a vast landscape that had been losing its life force for 2 years and was now in the late stages of a kind of ecological despair. The underground water had receded to depths that would take decades to recover. The root networks were fragmented, disconnected. The fungal communication systems that healthy land used to distribute nutrients across long distances collapsed into isolated pockets of surviving function. The geological heartbeat that she had felt as a child in every piece of Five Rivers ground she had ever touched, the low, round, full frequency that her mother had called the land's own breathing, was labored, strained, like a great thing that had been running for a very long time and was beginning to lose the certainty that it could continue. She stood at the border and breathed through it. This was the skill that mattered most, and that she had spent 2 years practicing. The ability to be fully present to the land's distress without being consumed by it. To hold the information without being broken by what the information contained. She breathed until the waves settled into something she could carry, and then she began walking again, south and west toward the capital. The dead fields started within a mile. She walked through them with her eyes open, and her gift fully receiving, cataloging the specific damage at each location against her map, verifying the correlation between what she had heard from across the border and what was visible on the surface. The correlations were exact. Every drain point she had mapped corresponded to a region of catastrophic crop failure. Every mage signature she had identified corresponded to a distinct pattern of damage. The cartographer's broad shallow extraction visible in the wide, even spread of the withered fields. The deep conduits work visible in the complete absence of any groundwater at the wells she passed. She stopped at a farmhouse 3 miles inside the border. A family was loading a cart in the gray morning light, not the hurried, panicked loading of emergency departure, but the slow, heavy loading of people who had made a decision that cost them everything and were now simply executing it because there was nothing else to do. A man and a woman, both middle-aged, with the specific exhaustion of people who had been fighting something for a long time before they stopped. 2 children, old enough to help, young enough that their faces still held the confusion of not fully understanding why home had stopped being possible. The man noticed her standing at the road's edge. He said, with the mild, deflated courtesy of someone whose capacity for social performance had been eroded by prolonged stress, mourning. Road to the capital is Pa Sable. If you're heading that way. Sable said, I am. She looked at the cart, at the furniture and packed goods, and the careful efficiency of people removing the evidence of a life. She said, how long have the fields been like this? The man looked at his fields. He said, 2 years now. Little longer, maybe. Started slow, and then it just kept going. Commission said drought. She paused, said wait it out. His wife made a sound that was not a word. He said, we waited. Sable said, you will be able to come back. I want you to know that. The man looked at her with the careful, depleted skepticism of someone who had been offered hope before and had learned what it cost to receive it. He said, is that right? She said, yes. What is happening to your land is not natural, and it can be stopped. She held his gaze. I know what it is, and I know where it is, and I am going to the capital to tell them. She paused. I am telling you so that at least one person who has lived inside this knows before I tell a room full of people who have only administered it. The man was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, 2 years. She said, I know. He turned back to the cart. She began walking again, southwest toward the capital, for days away through the dying land, carrying her map in its oilskin wrapping against her chest like the most important thing she had ever held. Which it was. The capital city of the Five Rivers Kingdom was called Verith, and it was dying quietly. Not dramatically, not with the visible, immediate devastation of the border fields, which had the decency to be obviously dead. Their withered stalks and cracked earth making the damage legible to anyone who looked. Verith's dying was subtler, the kind of decline that accumulated in the margins of ordinary life and was easily explained away by people with a professional interest in explanation. The market stalls with fewer varieties of produce than 2 years ago. The fountain at the city's central plaza running at half pressure. Its basin level lower than the watermark carved into its stone during a previous drought 40 years ago. The faces of the people who worked in the trades connected to agriculture, the millers, the grain merchants, the river transport workers, holding the particular tightness of people who had been worried for long enough that worry had become their resting expression. Sable heard the city's underground frequencies the moment she entered the gates and did not stop hearing them. A constant, distressed undertone beneath every other sensory experience of the city. The land's suffering conducted upward through the paving stones into the soles of her feet at every step. She requested formal audience at the Palace Petitions Office on her first afternoon in the city. Welcome back to the Whispers of Alpha King channel. Today we're going to present a new story that I believe you'll be very curious about and interested in because of its incredibly captivating content. Now let's explore it together until the end of the video. This is a fictional story compiled from various sources, supported by AI, and the content is purely for entertainment and educational purposes. The clerk at the petitions desk took her name, her house designation, and the nature of her request, evidence relating to the Royal Land Commission's drought investigation, and wrote them in a ledger with the bureaucratic thoroughness of someone who had no way of knowing that what they were recording was the most significant petition their ledger had ever contained. He told her the standard processing time for non-urgent petitions was 7 to 14 days. She said, "This is urgent." He said, "All petitioners consider their petition urgent." He said it not unkindly. She did not argue. She thanked him and went to find a room. She found a hostelry 3 streets from the palace's outer wall. She spent 3 days there. She did not spend those 3 days waiting in the passive sense. She spent them working, which was the only mode she possessed when there was work available to do. Each morning she walked the city's streets systematically, following the drain point frequencies through the urban substrate, mapping the network's extension beneath the capital itself. What she found was worse than she had mapped from Vethmark. 2 of the drain conduits ran directly beneath the palace's primary well system. One ran beneath the river intake that supplied the city's eastern residential district. The capital's groundwater was being extracted from below, while the population drank from diminishing surface reserves, and the court's commission attributed the decline to atmospheric conditions. On the 3rd day, the petition's clerk sent word that her audience had been granted. She arrived at the council chamber at the appointed hour, her map under her arm, wearing the cleanest clothes she had and the composed, prepared expression of a woman who had spent 2 years building toward this moment and was not going to allow the formality of the setting to reduce it. The chamber was large and deliberately imposing. High ceilings, long table of dark polished wood. Council members arranged along its sides in the seating order of rank and seniority. Morning light coming through windows positioned to fall on petitioners rather than council members, which she noted as an architectural choice that said a great deal about how this room understood the relationship between those who spoke and those who listened. She unrolled her map on the table. She presented her findings with the precise, evidence-based clarity she had been composing in her mind for months. The 7 drain points, their locations and depths, the mage signatures and their individual operational patterns, the correlation between each drain point's position and the documented crop failure regions in the Commission's own reports, the timeline establishing that the drainage had begun approximately 2 years and 3 months ago, predating the Commission's formation by 6 months. She spoke for 11 minutes without interruption. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Lord Cashin, the court's lead advisor, a broad-shouldered alpha man of senior years with the particular expression of someone who had spent a career being the smartest person in most rooms and had developed a reflexive resistance to information that arrived from unexpected directions, leaned forward and looked at the map. He said, "This was prepared by a Vethmark hostage." His tone did not make it a question. It made it a categorization, a way of placing the map and its maker in a box that had a preassigned significance. A significance that had nothing to do with the map's contents and everything to do with the map's origin. Sable looked at him. She said, "This was prepared by the only person in either kingdom who can hear what is happening to your soil." Cashin said, "The Commission's findings, based on 2 years of formal investigation by qualified experts, indicate natural drought conditions." He paused. "You are asking this council to set aside those findings based on a document prepared in captivity by an individual with no formal qualification in land science or geological survey." She said, "I am asking this council to look at a map on which every marked location corresponds exactly to a site in the Commission's own failure reports, and to ask themselves why a person who has been held in Vethmark for 2 years knows more about what is happening to the 5 Rivers Kingdom's land than the people who have been standing on it." The silence that followed was a different quality than the first silence. At the head of the table, King Aldren had not spoken. He had not spoken since she entered the room. He had been looking at the map with the focused stillness of a man who was thinking rather than waiting, which was a distinction she registered with the part of her that catalogued everything, filed it, and declined to assign premature significance to it. He looked up from the map. He looked at her. He said, "What is your name?" She told him. She said it the way she said everything, plainly, without performance, without the softening inflection that people sometimes used when introducing themselves to kings. The slight upward tilt at the end of the name that made it a question rather than a statement, as though asking permission to exist in the room under that designation. She said Sable, House Veneth, and she held his gaze for exactly as long as it took him to receive the information. And then she looked back at the map because the map was what mattered and she needed him looking at it too. The council session ended inconclusively. Cashin moved to table the matter pending formal verification by the Land Commission's senior surveyor, which was seconded by 2 other council members before Aldren said, in the same quiet, focused tone he had used to ask her name, "She will be provided with a cartographer and the resources to conduct field verification within the week. The matter will return to this council when the verification is complete." It was not a triumph. It was a foothold. She had learned the difference between those 2 things a long time ago, and she had learned not to spend the energy required for a triumph's emotion on a foothold's outcome. She rolled her map, tucked it under her arm, and left the council chamber with the same composure she had entered it. She did not look at Aldren when she left. She did not need to. He had said her name when he asked for it, and had received her answer, and had then done the minimum useful thing available to him in that moment, which was more than she had expected, and less than the situation required. And she was going to hold it in exactly that proportion until the evidence of the field verification made proportion irrelevant. Aldren, meanwhile, went directly to his head steward. He had a specific question, and he asked it in the specific, clipped language of a man who was keeping his expression controlled, because the expression he was actually feeling was not one he was prepared to perform in front of his steward. He said, "Pull the Vethmark hostage arrangement file, the one from 2 years ago. Bring it to my study." The steward, who had been serving Aldren for 16 years and possessed the particular skill of hearing what was underneath what was said, went immediately. Aldren went to his study and stood at his desk and did not sit down. The file arrived in 12 minutes. He opened it. It was 11 pages, the treaty terms, the diplomatic correspondence, the administrative selection criteria, the formal documentation of the arrangement. He read it with the same thoroughness he brought to all documentation, moving through each page without skipping, because he had learned early that the things he needed to know were as likely to be in the unremarkable sections as in the headlined ones. He found the selection criteria on page 4. Female Omega. Minor rank. House Veneth. No critical palace function. Family connections insufficient to create political complications. No name. He turned to page 5. Page 6. He read the formal arrangement terms, the diplomatic exchange conditions, the treaty obligations. He reached the final page, the signature page. His own signature at the bottom in the ink he recognized as the pen he kept on his formal desk and used for significant documents, the date 2 years and 2 months ago. Her name appeared in the final line, added after his signature, in the administrator's handwriting. He had signed an order to remove a person from the kingdom and place her in diplomatic captivity for an open-ended term, and the order had not contained her name when he signed it, and he had not noticed, had not asked, had not paused before signing to say, "What is this person called?" He sat down. He sat at his desk with the file open to the final page, and he thought about the woman who had just stood in his council chamber for 11 minutes and presented a complete, precise, evidence-documented map of a supernatural assault that his court's formal commission had failed to identify in 2 years of investigation. And he thought about the fact that she had built that map in captivity, in 45-minute increments through a boundary wall. And he thought about the fact that she had been in captivity because he had signed a document that did not contain her name. He closed the file. He went to the window and stood there for a while looking at the palace gardens below. which were maintained despite the drought by redirecting water from the palace's deep well system, which meant that they were green and functional while the farms 30 miles away were dying. A fact that he was finding, in this particular moment, difficult to look at without revision. Sable, in the small room in the outer palace wing that had been assigned to her pending the field verification, was meeting the junior cartographer who had been sent to assist her. He was young, precise, earnest, carrying a leather satchel of survey instruments and the expression of someone who had been briefed on the task and was approaching it with professional preparation. He opened her map on the workroom table. He looked at it for 10 minutes. He cross-referenced 3 locations against his existing survey records, then 2 more. Then the remaining entries in a rapid sequence that had a growing urgency to it. The movements of a person whose professional expectations are being systematically exceeded by what they are looking at. He looked up. He said, "Every location you marked corresponds to a reported crop failure site. Every single one." Sable said, "Yes." He said, He paused, looking for the right word and finding only the honest one. "This is exact." She said, "I know." He said, "How did you do this from across the border?" She said, "I listened very carefully for a very long time." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the map with the expression of someone revising a set of assumptions they had not previously known they were holding. Then he said, "When do we go to the field?" She said, "Tomorrow at first light." She turned back to the map and began annotating the field verification sequence, which drain points to visit first, in what order, by what route, and the cartographer pulled up a stool and began making notes beside her, and the work continued in the efficient, focused quiet of 2 people who understood that the work was what mattered. That evening, in the thin private space between waking and sleep, the bond stirred. She felt it as warmth, not the warmth of the Earthsong gift. Not the specific resonance of the land's frequency, but something warmer and more personal. Something that located itself not in her palms or her feet, but in the center of her chest, just below the sternum. She knew what it was. She identified it immediately with the clear-eyed recognition of someone who had suspected it for a long time and was now receiving confirmation. She lay still and breathed and looked at the ceiling. She said to herself, quietly and firmly, in the privacy of her own mind, "Not yet." She meant it, but the warmth did not entirely leave. The study was the quietest room in the palace at midnight. Aldren knew this from long experience. He had spent more midnights in this room than in any other, working through the accumulated demands of governance in the hours when the palace's human noise had subsided, and the particular quality of silence that remained was the silence of a large building settling into itself. The creak and shift of old stone finding its position in the cooling night air. He had always found it easier to think here, in this silence. He had always assumed this was because silence cleared the mind for the work. He was beginning to understand that what he had been calling clarity was, at least in part, the absence of anything that challenged him. Sable's map was spread across his desk. He had asked for a copy to be made. The cartographer had done it that afternoon with careful precision, producing a facsimile that matched the original in every marked location and notation. The original had been returned to Sable. He had the copy. He had been looking at it for 2 hours, tracing the drain point locations with one finger the way he might trace a road on a travel map, moving from point to point with the patient. Repeated attention of someone trying to understand something that resisted the modes of understanding they had been trained to apply. 43 separate impact sites. 2 years of crop failure, river poisoning, livestock illness, and groundwater recession. All of it accounted for, all of it located, all of it connected to a deliberate, coordinated, externally operated network of supernatural extraction that his court's formal commission had spent 18 months investigating and had concluded, in the careful language of qualified professionals who had failed to find what they were looking for, was consistent with natural atmospheric drought. He thought about those 18 months. He thought about the quarterly commission reports he had read, thoroughly as he read everything, because thoroughness was a discipline he had maintained since his father had told him at 14 that a king who read selectively was a king who governed the story he preferred rather than the kingdom he had, and he thought about the specific language of those reports, the way they had been written, the precision of the uncertainty. The careful accumulation of natural explanations for phenomena that, laid against Sable's map, were not natural at all and had never been. He had read those reports and had asked questions and had accepted the commission's conclusions because the commission was composed of qualified experts and he was a king, not a geologist. And the appropriate relationship between a king and expert knowledge was trust calibrated by accountability. He had believed this principle was sufficient. It had not been sufficient. The knowledge that would have been sufficient had been sitting in a room in a Vethmark estate, being accumulated in 45-minute increments by a woman whose name had not been on the document he signed. He pulled the hostage file from the desk drawer where he had placed it after the steward brought it. He had been returning to it at intervals throughout the day. The way a person returned to something that required them to look at it directly rather than from the corner of their vision. He opened it again to the final page. Her name in the final line. In someone else's handwriting. He thought about the receiving hall. He had been in that hall on the morning in question. He could place himself there. Could reconstruct the general shape of the occasion, the documentation, the signing, the administrative efficiency of a diplomatic transaction being processed and completed. He could not reconstruct her face. He had not seen her face. He had walked into the hall and gone directly to the administrator and the documentation, and he had not looked at the people the documentation concerned, because the people the documentation concerned had been, in his operational understanding of that morning, the administrative content of the transaction rather than its human substance. He set the file down. He thought about her in the council chamber, 12 hours ago, standing at the far end of the long table with the map spread before her, and speaking for 11 minutes with the precise, complete, undefensive clarity of someone who had prepared their evidence so thoroughly that the evidence itself carried the weight without requiring performance. He had watched her speak and had felt. Underneath the professional attention, he was directing at the substance of what she was saying. Something else, a recognition he could not entirely account for. A quality of attention to her specifically that was different from the attention he directed at information in general. He had asked her name. He had needed to ask her name. This was the fact he kept returning to, the one that resisted being absorbed and metabolized the way other difficult facts could be absorbed and metabolized with enough time and enough honest thinking. He had sent her away for 2 years to a foreign duchy, and he had not known her name when she came back. He had been governing a kingdom that she had saved from across a border, in captivity. In 45-minute increments, without his knowledge or his authorization or his gratitude, and he had needed to ask what she was called. He got up from the desk. He went to the window and looked out at the palace gardens, green and maintained and drawing from the deep wells while the farms 30 miles away were dying. He made 2 decisions. The first, the palace gardens would be placed on reduced water allocation beginning tomorrow. The excess redirected to the irrigation systems of the nearest affected farming communities. And this would be announced not as a gesture, but as a policy with a specific remediation timeline attached. The second was harder to name cleanly because it was less a decision than an acknowledgement. The acknowledgement that something had been set in motion by the morning he had signed a document without a name. Something that had not concluded with Sable's return or her map or her 11 minutes in the council chamber. Something that was going to require him to be a different kind of attentive than he had been. To look at people the way he had failed to look at her in the receiving hall. To know names before he signed documents that concerned the people who carried them. He looked at the map one more time. 43 drain points. 2 years. 1 woman. He did not sleep for a long time after that. The field southeast of the capital had been a wheat farm. Sable knew this from the cartographer's survey records, which placed it as one of the most productive agricultural parcels in the central region 2 years ago. 300 acres of deep-soiled flatland with reliable water access from a tributary of the Second River and a documented yield history going back 4 generations of the same farming family. The family had left 8 months ago. The Land Commission's site visit report, which the cartographer had pulled from the archives and which Sable had read on the walkout, described the soil as severely desiccated. The tributary flow as reduced to approximately 12% of historical average. And the outlook for natural recovery as uncertain pending improved atmospheric conditions. The drain point she had mapped beneath this field was the second deepest in the network. She felt at the moment she stepped off the road onto the field's margin, a low, sustained pulling beneath her feet. The specific wrongness she had catalogued from across the border now immediate and undeniable. Like the difference between reading about pain and standing inside it. She removed her boots. The cartographer, whose name was Perrin, and who had in 3 days of working beside her developed the focused, adaptive efficiency of someone who had revised their assumptions about what their job entailed and had decided the revision was interesting rather than inconvenient, made a note in his survey log and said nothing. He had learned quickly that she worked in silence, and that the silence was not absence of communication, but the specific quality of attention that her gift required. She pressed her right foot flat to the cracked earth. The drain point's signature rose through her soul like a voice she had been listening to for 2 years, and now heard with the full, close, unfiltered clarity of proximity. She stood in it for 30 seconds, mapping its current depth and extraction rate against the baseline she had established from Vethmark. Noting the changes, it was deeper now, drawing harder. The mage signature more urgent than it had been 3 weeks ago when she had made her final border measurement. She moved to the next flagged location, 50 paces east, and crouched to press both palms to the soil. She was in this position, kneeling in the dead field with her palms flat and her eyes closed and her gift fully open, when she heard the sound of a horse being reined in at the field's edge, and then the sound of boots on cracked earth, unhurried, coming toward her. She knew who it was before she opened her eyes. Not from the bond, though the bond registered his proximity with the quiet, persistent warmth she had been managing since the night in the hostelry. From the specific quality of the footsteps, the even, deliberate pace of someone accustomed to covering ground without announcing themselves. Without the additional weight of guards or retinue or the small sounds that accumulated around a person who was always attended. He had come alone. She opened her eyes. Aldren stood 5 paces away in plain riding clothes. The same unremarkable brown coat she had noted in the council chamber was not actually unremarkable because it fit too well for its plainness to be accidental. He was looking at the cracked earth around her hands with the focused attention he directed at everything. The quality of attention she had noticed in the council chamber and was learning to distinguish from performance. He said, "The commission surveyor confirmed the first 3 sites this morning." She said, "I know. Perrin told me." She stood, brushing the pale dead soil from her palms, and picked up her boots. Aldren looked at the field around them, the full 300 acres of dead flatland. The absent tributary visible as a shallow dry channel along the field's eastern edge. The sky above it clear and blue, and entirely blameless. He said, "Walk me through what you are doing." It was not a command. It was a request structured as a directive, which was, she was coming to understand. How he communicated most things, the king's habit of framing everything in the active mode. Stripped of the upward inflection that made requests sound tentative, but without the weight of authority that made commands sound closed. She said, "I am at the second drain point." She described what she could feel through her feet and hands, the extraction rate, the depth of the conduit, the specific qualities of this mage's signature that distinguished it from the others. She described it in the precise, sensory language of her gift, not softening the terminology or translating it into approximations, because she had decided in the council chamber that she was going to speak about her gift in its own language, and people could meet it there or not at all. He listened with the particular quality of someone who was not simply waiting for her to finish, but was actively incorporating what she was saying into an existing framework and adjusting the framework as needed. He asked questions. They were specific, intelligent questions about the relationship between extraction depth and surface damage, about whether the mage signatures could be traced to individuals, about the timeline of the network's assembly. She answered each one directly, adding information where the question revealed a gap in what she had covered, noting where her knowledge was certain and where it was inference. They worked through the afternoon together. Sable moved through the field's flagged locations, 8 of them across the 300 acres, with Aldren following and Perrin recording, and the sun moving across the sky in the way it moved across dying land, with the same indifferent beauty it brought to everything. At the 6th location, crouching over a point where the drain conduit ran so close to the surface that the soil above it had collapsed slightly inward, creating a shallow depression perhaps 3 feet across. She said without planning to say it, "This one started before the others." Aldren said, "How much before?" She said, 6 months at minimum. Possibly more. The damage pattern is layered differently. She looked at the depression. Someone was testing the technique before they deployed it at scale. This was the proof of concept. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "That means the decision to do this was made more than 2.5 years ago." She said, "Yes." The implication of this settled between them in the silence of the dead field, that the assault on the Five Rivers Kingdom had been in planning before the Drought Commission existed, before the treaty with Vethmark was signed. Possibly before he had walked into a receiving hall and signed a document that sent her across the border and removed the one person who could have identified this a year earlier. He did not say this. She did not say it. But it was there, in the field, in the specific quality of the silence after she spoke. The sun was going down. She straightened and looked at him. She said, "The next location is 3 miles east. We should make it before the light goes." He said, "Then let us go." She put her boots on and began walking east through the dead wheat field, and he fell into step. Beside her and Perrin followed 3 paces behind with his survey log and the flags and the quiet. Professional composure of a man who was recording something he understood was significant without fully understanding, yet how significant. The drain point beneath the palace's east wing was the one that bothered her most. Not because it was the deepest or the most actively extractive. It was neither, ranking 4th in the network by depth and 3rd by current extraction rate. What bothered her was its location. The other drain points were positioned in agricultural land, in river systems, in the geological substrate of the central farming region, placed by someone who understood the kingdom's food and water systems and had targeted them with a cold, practical precision. But this one ran beneath the palace itself, beneath the residential wing, beneath the rooms where the king slept and worked and conducted the governance of a dying kingdom. And its positioning felt less like agricultural sabotage and more like a statement. "We are here too. We have been here all along." She had identified it on her 3rd day in the capital, walking the inner courtyard during a permitted afternoon circuit. And she had told Perrin about it that evening, and had not yet mentioned it to the council because she was waiting for the field verification to be complete and formally accepted before she added the information that the enemy's network extended to within 40 feet of the king's private study. She mentioned it now because the east wing was where she had been housed. The room was adequate. The word arrived automatically. The same word she had used for the Vethmark room, and she recognized with a slight private irony that she had apparently developed a consistent standard for spaces that were functional without being chosen. It had a window that faced the inner courtyard, a writing desk that did not wobble, and a floor beneath which a mage's drain conduit ran with sufficient proximity that she could feel it through the flagstones when she stood still. A low constant note of wrongness that made the indoor air feel subtly pressured, the way air felt before a storm that was not actually coming. She preferred the small courtyard outside the east wing's ground floor door. She was sitting in it on the evening after the field verification's 4th day, when Aldren arrived with a covered plate from the kitchens. She looked at the plate. He said, "The kitchen sent your portion to the wrong room. I intercepted it in the corridor." She said, "How did you know it was mine?" He said, "It was the only plate in the corridor." This was, she understood, either a coincidence or a convenient explanation for something that was not quite a coincidence. And she did not have the information to determine which, and she found herself, in this small moment, less interested in resolving the ambiguity than she would have expected. She said, "Thank you," and moved along the bench to make room. And he sat down at the other end of it with the unremarkable ease of someone who had decided to sit and was not performing the decision. They ate. The courtyard was small and old, its stone worn smooth and its single tree, a stubborn elder that had been growing in the corner for longer than the east wing had been standing. By the look of its trunk, putting out leaves with the determined vitality of something that had simply refused to absorb the surrounding defeat. The drain point below them was present but distant, filtered upward through several feet of foundation stone. And in the open air of the courtyard its frequency was diffuse enough that she could sit in the courtyard without the indoor heaviness, without the feeling of pressure on the chest that came from being directly above it for extended periods. She had mentioned this to no one. Aldren said, looking at the elder tree, "Perrin tells me you worked through all 14 locations in 4 days." She said 12. 2 were inaccessible without additional equipment. We flagged them for follow-up. He said, "He also tells me the verification is essentially complete, that every location matches." She said, "Every accessible location matches. The 2 remaining will also match." "I know what I heard." A brief silence. He said, "I do not doubt it." He said it without qualification, without the softening hedge that people added when they wanted to express conditional belief while maintaining the appearance of full belief. He said it the way he said things when he had finished thinking about them. She looked at the tree. She said, "There is a drain point beneath this wing. 4th deepest in the network. I identified it 3 days ago." He was still for a moment. He said, "You have been sleeping above a drain point for a week." She said, "It is not the most uncomfortable thing I have done in 2 years." He was quiet. She could feel the quality of his attention shift, not toward the drain point, which was a problem he could address, but toward the comment, which was a door she had opened that had not been opened before in his presence. She did not close it. She said, "I want to tell you what the 2 years were like. Not to assign you the emotional weight of it. I have carried that weight, and it is mine and I have no interest in putting it down on someone else's floor. But I want to say it aloud to someone who needs to hear it, because I have been precise and evidential and professionally composed in every room I have entered in this palace. And I am sitting in a courtyard above a drain point at the end of a long day, and I would like, for one conversation, to simply speak plainly." He said, "Then speak plainly." She told him. She told him about the room in the Vethmark estate, the wobbly desk, the 45-minute walks, the 11 months of engineering to reach the granite hilltop. She told him about the sedatives she had refused and the physician who still felt guilty, and the household guard who had eventually started leaving her an extra 5 minutes at the boundary wall, because he had noticed she always stopped there, and he had never asked why. She told him about the letter from the Drought Commission that she had read through the study door, about pressing her hand to the wall and hearing the conduit 3 feet below the foundation. She told him plainly, and without performance, and with the specific, quiet completeness of someone who had been carrying a weight that was not theirs to carry, and was now laying it out not to give it away, but to have it witnessed. She said, "The morning you signed the order, I was in the receiving hall." He said, "I know." She said, "You did not look up." He said, "No, I did not." She said, "I want you to know that I am not telling you this to make you feel what I felt. I am telling you this because I think the specific mechanism of what happened that morning, the way a person became a transaction, needs to be named clearly, by the person it happened to, in the presence of the person who signed the transaction, so that it exists as a stated truth between us rather than an unstated one." He received this without defense. He did not apologize. She had not asked for an apology, and had told him she was not seeking one. And she found that he had listened to this carefully enough to understand it, which was not a small thing. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the elder tree with the expression of a man holding something difficult with the intention of continuing to hold it rather than finding a way to put it down quickly. Then he said, "My name, when I was a child, before the title, my name was just Aldren. Not the king, not the sovereign, just a name my mother gave me because she liked the sound of it." She looked at him. He said, "I tell you this because I think you are the first person in a very long time who has spoken to me as though I am the person attached to a name rather than the name attached to a position." He paused. "I find that I do not want to lose that." The elder tree moved in a small evening wind. The drain point below them sang its low, wrong note into the stones. Above it, in the worn stone courtyard, 2 people sat in the specific silence of something that had not yet been named, but was already, undeniably present. She woke at 2 minutes past 3 in the morning. Not gradually, not from a dream, not with the slow surfacing of ordinary waking. She woke all at once and completely, the way she had learned to wake when the Earthsong demanded it. her body coming to full alertness before her conscious mind had finished registering the reason. She was sitting upright on the edge of the bed with her palms flat on the floor, before she had fully oriented herself to the room around her. The sound was enormous. She had never heard anything like it in 2 years of listening, not the sustained pulling distress of the drain network in its regular operation, not the localized wrongness she felt through the flagstones of the east wing floor, but something of a different order entirely. A single drain point, the one she had catalogued as the seventh, the deepest. The one with the cold, precise signature of the most controlled and most dangerous of the mage operators, had activated at a level of extraction so far beyond its previous operational range that the frequency it produced was not the low, sustained pulling she had mapped, but a screaming, not metaphorically, with the harrowing specificity of something alive being damaged past the threshold of ordinary suffering. She felt it from 30 miles away like a physical blow to the chest. She was dressed and downstairs with her map unrolled on the workroom table before the palace's night staff had begun to stir, marking the activation point with one precise circle and writing beside it the extraction rate she was estimating from the frequency's intensity and the depth signature she had memorized across 2 years of careful listening. She heard footsteps in the corridor. Aldren came through the door still wearing his nightclothes with a coat thrown over them, his hair undressed, carrying the expression of a man who had been awake anyway and had felt the shift in the palace's atmosphere even without the gift that would have told him what caused it. He had been sleeping lightly, if at all. She had not known this. She noted it now. He looked at the map. He looked at the circle. He said, "What happened?" She said, "The 7th drain point." She tapped the location. 30 miles northwest of the capital. Full activation, well beyond its standard extraction rate. Whatever it was drawing on before tonight, it is drawing on everything now. He said, "What does that mean for the land above it?" She said, "Nothing good." She paused, listening through the flagstones, trying to gauge from the resonance of the activation how long it had been running at this level. The frequency had an edge to it that suggested recent escalation rather than sustained maximum extraction. It had not been running at this level for long. An hour, perhaps. 2 at most. She said, "The ground above a full activation at that depth will be destabilized. Surface collapse is probable." He said, "How probable?" She said, "Certain. The question is scale and timing, not weather." 2 hours later, the Royal Messenger Service delivered a report from the garrison captain stationed at the nearest military post to the 7th drain point's location, a post town called Heron's Ford, 32 miles northwest of the capital, situated above a river crossing that was also, according to Sable's map, positioned almost exactly above the drain point's central conduit. The report was brief and written in the clipped, factual language of military communication. A sinkhole 200 feet in diameter had opened without warning in the early morning hours at the eastern edge of Heron's Ford, collapsing the town's primary well and water mill. No fatalities. Significant structural damage to 4 adjacent buildings. The ground around the perimeter of the collapse was continuing to settle. The garrison captain requested engineering support and asked whether the phenomenon was related to the drought conditions previously reported to the Land Commission. Sable had been expecting something like this. She had not been expecting the scale. 200 feet. She looked at the report, and then at her map, and then at the location of the 7th conduit, and she ran the calculation she had been carrying in the back of her mind since she identified that signature on the granite hilltop, the one that had told her this conduit alone, given enough time, would render the central basin permanently uninhabitable. She had been thinking about enough time in terms of years. The mages were not thinking in years anymore. She said, "They know I mapped them." Aldren looked at her. She said, "The timing is not coincidental. I completed the field verification yesterday. The cartographer filed the formal confirmation with the Land Commission this morning. Whatever communication network the mages are operating through, they have access to information about the verification. They know the map exists, and they know it has been formally accepted." She looked at the sinkhole report. "This is a demonstration. They are showing the court what they can do when they choose to do it at full capacity, before the court can act on what I have given them." Aldren said, "Can they find you specifically?" She said, "They know I exist." The map identifies 7 mage signatures with enough precision that any of those 7 operators would recognize their own signature in it. They know there is someone in the Five Rivers Kingdom who can hear their network clearly enough to map it. She paused. The question is whether they know I am here, in the palace, rather than somewhere on the road. The door opened. A royal messenger, out of breath, young, held out a sealed letter with both hands. She looked at the seal. Vethmark. She looked at Aldren. He took it from the messenger and broke the seal and read it. And his expression did the specific thing it did when he was holding something difficult with the intention of not performing his reaction to it. A slight stillness around the eyes, a controlled, deliberate breath. He handed it to her. It was a single sentence, written in Duke Heron's personal hand on Vethmark ducal stationery. "Return the Omega or we accelerate." Sable read it twice. She set it on the table beside her map. She said, "They are coordinating with Vethmark. The mages are not an independent operation. They are operating under ducal authorization." Aldren said nothing. She said, "This changes the political structure of what we are dealing with." He said quietly, "Yes." She said, "It also means the sinkhole at Heron's Ford was not a demonstration to the court." She looked at him. "It was a message to me." The room was very quiet. Outside, the palace was beginning to wake into its morning routine. The sound of staff and horses, and the ordinary machinery of a functioning court, all of it proceeding with the comfortable momentum of a large institution that did not yet know that 2 things had changed in the night: the scale of the threat to the kingdom, and the identity of the person that threat was now specifically directed at. The emergency council session was called for the 9th hour of the morning. Sable was not invited. This was not an oversight. She understood it as a deliberate procedural choice. The kind that institutions made when they needed to discuss a problem that concerned a person without the complication of that person's presence in the room. She understood it without taking it personally, the way she understood most things that institutions did, as the expression of the institution's internal logic rather than a considered judgment about her specifically. A logic that had its own consistency even when that consistency produced poor outcomes. She waited in the outer corridor on a bench that had been placed there, she suspected, for precisely this purpose, the accommodation of people whose participation in events was contingent rather than primary. The bench was well made and uncomfortable in the specific way of furniture that had been designed, for the appearance of consideration rather than its practice. She sat on it with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and her gift open at a moderate depth, listening to the drain point beneath the east wing and the distant echo of the 7th conduit's ongoing elevated extraction and the deeper, slower frequencies of the palace's geological foundation, which were stressed in ways that had been invisible to everyone except her for 2 years and were now at least documented, at least named. The council chamber's acoustic properties were, as she had suspected since her first visit, extremely good. She could hear the debate without effort. Lord Cashin opened the formal discussion with the precision of a man who had prepared his argument in advance and was delivering it according to plan. He laid out the treaty obligation in its specific legal language. The Vethmark arrangement required Sable's continued residence in the duchy for the treaty term, and her departure without formal release constituted a breach. He acknowledged the field verification's findings. He acknowledged the sinkhole at Heron's Ford. He said these developments were serious and warranted serious response. He said the treaty obligation nonetheless remained legally binding, and its violation created diplomatic and security risks that could not be set aside on the basis of one individual's value to a current investigation, however significant. He said, "She is an Omega of minor rank. The treaty value outweighs the map." The words arrived through the chamber door with the same clarity as everything else, and Sable received them the same way she received the drain point's frequency, as information, as something she needed to know the full shape of, something she was not going to look away from simply because looking directly at it was uncomfortable. She had been an Omega of minor rank when she was traded. She was still an Omega of minor rank, technically, by the legal and social classification system that had produced that phrase and given it the weight that Lord Cashin was placing on it. She sat with that. Two other council members spoke in support of Cashin's position, Lord Tavin of the Southern Border Administration, whose trade relationships with Vethmark were significant enough that his position required no explanation, and Lady Orvin of the Internal Affairs Council, whose objection appeared to be primarily procedural. The concern of a woman who had spent her career defending institutional process and was finding this situation's disregard for process personally affront. Then there was a silence that was different from the silences between other contributions. Aldren said, "Leave us." She heard it clearly, 2 words, spoken at the volume of a man who had decided something and was implementing the decision without announcement or preamble. She heard the sounds of people gathering themselves, the scrape of chairs, the quiet professional bustle of a council dispersing from a chamber at a king's request. She heard the room empty. Then she heard Aldren, alone in the council chamber, say her name. Just her name, Sable, spoken into the empty chamber at the volume of an ordinary conversation. As though he was speaking to someone present, as though he was practicing the specific weight of it, the balance of its 2 syllables. The sound of it said without the apparatus of a court session, or a petition procedure, or the formal presentation of evidence. Said the way a person said a name when they were alone with the fact of it. She sat very still on the bench. She did not press her ear to the door. She did not need to. The acoustic properties of the corridor wall were nearly as good as the chamber itself, and his voice was clear. And he said her name once, and then was silent for a moment, and then said it again, slightly differently, as though he was asking a question that the name contained, and that he was not sure yet how to formulate beyond the name itself. The chamber door opened. He stood in the doorway and looked at her on the bench. She looked back at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment, in the specific silence of 2 people who have simultaneously discovered that the other person was aware of more than they had been assumed to be aware of. He said, "How long have you been sitting there?" She said, "Since the session began." He said, "The corridor has very good acoustics." She said, "I noticed." He stepped back from the doorway and held it open. She rose from the bench and walked into the council chamber, and he closed the door behind them, and they stood at either end of the long table. The table that still held the faint ring marks from where her rolled map had rested on its first day. And the morning light came through the windows at its prosecutorial angle and fell on both of them equally. She said, "What did you decide?" He said, "I have not decided. I sent the council away because the decision is mine, and I needed to stop performing the deliberation and begin the actual one." She said, He said, "And I am standing here with you instead of making you wait in the corridor." She said, "That is not a decision. That is a location." The smallest thing moved in his expression, not quite a smile, the territory adjacent to one. The expression of a man who had said something that revealed more than he intended and had decided not to walk it back. He said, "No. You are right. It is not a decision. It is a beginning of one." He moved to the table. He picked up the Vethmark letter, the single sentence in Ducarin's hand, and he held it for a moment. He said, "I am going to deny the Duke's request and decline the treaty's continuation on the grounds of Vethmark's demonstrated participation in a hostile action against the 5 Rivers Kingdom." He set the letter down. "That is the decision." She said, "Cashin will object." He said, "Cashin will object. I will hear his objection, and I will override it." She said, "There will be consequences from Vethmark." He said, "There will be consequences from Vethmark. The alternative is to return you to a duchy that has just demonstrated it is coordinating with enemy mages to destroy my kingdom's land, which is not a decision I am willing to make." He paused. He said, "And you are not a transaction. Whatever the file said when I signed it, whatever the treaty terms say, you are not a transaction, and I will not treat you as one again." She looked at him for a long moment across the table. She said, "I need you to understand something. I did not come back to the 5 Rivers Kingdom to be protected or retrieved or recognized. I came back because the kingdom needed what I carry, and I was the only one who could bring it. My reasons had nothing to do with you." He said, "I know." She said, "I need you to know that clearly, not as a courtesy, as a fact." He said, "I know it as a fact." He met her gaze steadily. "And I need you to know that my decision just now also had nothing to do with you. It had to do with what is right. He paused. The fact that those two things align in this case does not make either one less true. She held this for a moment. It was, she found, an answer she could not argue with. She picked up her map from the corner of the table where she had left it that morning. She said, "Then we need to discuss the counter-ritual. Because the 7th conduit's current extraction rate means we have less time than I originally calculated. And Vethmark's involvement changes the operational risk significantly." He said, "Tell me." She unrolled the map across the table. Outside the council chamber, in the outer corridor, the bench sat empty in the morning light, and the acoustic wall behind it held the shape of everything that had just been said, for no one to hear now but the old stone itself, which had been listening to this palace's business for 300 years, and which Sable, had she pressed her hand to it, could have told you was humming with the specific frequency of something that had shifted irrevocably in the night, like the deep earth moving along a fault line, slow and foundational and permanent. The collapsed shrine was marked on no official map. Sable had found it through the network itself. The 7th conduit ran directly beneath it, and the conduit's frequency at that location had a specific resonant quality that differed from every other point along its length. A depth and complexity of tone that suggested the shrine's stone was acting as an amplifier, an ancient structure whose original purpose and the mage's current exploitation were, in some terrible way, aligned. Sacred places had always been acoustically significant in her experience. The people who built them had understood, even without naming the understanding in the formal language of gift theory, that certain configurations of stone and earth and water produced frequencies that carried further and meant more. The mages had found this one and buried their central conduit beneath it and used 300 years of accumulated sacred resonance as a power source. She found this, among all the things she had mapped, the most personally offensive. She laid out the counter-ritual to Aldren and a circle of 4, Perrin, 2 soldiers named Davin and Reth, whom Aldren had chosen for their specific combination of competence and discretion, and the court's senior archivist, an elderly woman named Corvin, who had spent 40 years cataloging the kingdom's historical documents and who had, upon being shown the Temple Covenant text that Sable had reconstructed from her Earthsong readings of the shrine's amplified frequencies, gone very quiet, and then produced from the archive's deepest storage a partial manuscript that she had been cataloging as an incomplete agricultural text for 20 years, and that was, in fact, the earliest known written description of the Earthsong gift and its application to land healing. Corvin set the manuscript on the table beside Sable's map without comment. The act spoke with perfect sufficiency. Sable began. She explained that the counter-ritual was not, in the conventional sense, a ritual at all. It required no ceremony, no preparation of materials, no invocation of external forces. What it required was her gift at full depth, directed with complete precision at the central conduit, producing a specific disruptive frequency that would collapse the drain network the way a single resonant tone collapsed a glass that had been vibrating at a harmonic of that frequency. The physics of it, translated into the language of gift theory that Corvin's manuscript provided, was elegant. The execution was not. To produce the disrupting frequency, she needed to go deeper than she had ever gone, deeper than the granite hilltop in Vethmark, deeper than the full network reading she had done on the morning she completed her map. She needed to find the central conduit's fundamental frequency, the specific tone that the entire network ran on, the base note beneath all 7 mage signatures, and produce its exact disruptive inverse. To do that, she needed to hold the full network in her awareness simultaneously and find the common thread running through all 7 signatures while in direct physical contact with the amplifying stone of the shrine. She had never held the full network simultaneously. She had approached it on the hilltop, but had not gone to the depth required to find the fundamental. She had pulled back from that depth because she had understood, even then, that it was not a place to go alone without preparation and without someone who knew where she had gone. Davin, one of the soldiers, asked the question that was in the room. She answered it directly. She did not know with certainty what the ritual would cost her. She knew it would be significant. She knew that no one had documented a full network collapse of this scale being performed by a single gift holder, which meant the historical record offered no reliable guidance on recovery. She knew the theoretical basis for believing she would survive it, because the disruptive frequency. Once produced, propagated through the network autonomously, she would not need to sustain it, only initiate it. Aldren had been listening with the complete, focused attention she had come to understand was his genuine mode, rather than a performance of it. He asked the question she had been waiting for. The one that revealed whether a person was thinking about the task or about the person performing it. The question was not strategic. It was not about the network or the timeline or the operational risks. He asked what she needed from them. What specifically, from the people in this room, would give her the best chance. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Someone who knows my name. Present. At the surface. So that when I come back up from whatever depth this takes me to, there is a voice I recognize to follow." The room held this quietly. Corvin made a note in the margin of her manuscript in the careful archival hand of someone adding new information to an old record. Perrin looked at his survey log and then at the map with the focused composure of a man who had been revising his understanding of his work for 2 weeks and had arrived at a place of settled, if humbled, clarity. Aldren looked at Sable with an expression that was not performance and not the controlled neutrality of a king managing a difficult situation, but the straightforward, undisguised expression of a man who had heard something that mattered to him and was not going to pretend otherwise. He said, "I will be there." The circle was quiet for a moment. Then Sable rolled the map to the shrine's location and began walking them through the approach route. The timing, the specific positions she needed each person to hold. And the room organized itself around the work with the focused, efficient seriousness of people who understood that what was coming required the best of what each of them was. Outside the archivist's window, 30 miles northwest, the 7th conduit screamed its extraction note into the earth, and the ground above Heron's Ford continued its slow, deliberate collapse. They had 3 days. They reached the shrine at the gray edge of dawn. The road from the capital had been 30 miles of dying land, the worst of it concentrated in the final 10 miles northwest of Heron's Ford, where the 7th conduit's elevated extraction had been running for 4 days, and the damage had surfaced with a visibility that no Drought Commission report would be able to explain away. The fields on either side of the road were not merely withered but collapsed inward, the soil subsiding along the conduit's path in a slow, continuous settling that had opened fissures in the earth 2 and 3 feet deep, running parallel to the road like wounds that had been made with great deliberateness and no particular urgency. The trees along the road's edge had shed their leaves 4 weeks early, standing bare and gray in the morning mist like an audience that had arrived before the event and was waiting without much hope. Sable walked through it with her gift fully open and did not look away. She needed to know the current state of the network before she reached the shrine, needed to take the full measure of what she was walking into, to update her internal map with the 4 days of change since the activation, to understand the network as it was now rather than as it had been when she completed her field verification. She walked and she listened, and the information arrived in the continuous, layered way of Earthsong fully received, the 7th conduit screaming extraction. The other 6 running at elevated levels in apparent sympathetic response to the 7th's acceleration. The central shrine's amplification resonance growing stronger with each step she took toward it, as though the ancient stone was aware of her approach and was preparing. Or warning. She could not entirely tell the difference. The shrine itself was not visible until they were 20 feet from it. It had been swallowed by the earth over the centuries, not destroyed but absorbed, the way old things were absorbed when the ground reclaimed them. The walls subsided to knee height and covered in the gray-green moss of extended obscurity. The carved figures at its entrance warned to suggestions of shape by weather and time. What remained was a rough circle of ancient stone perhaps 15 feet across, open to the sky, with a flat central stone at its heart that was the source of the amplification frequency she had been tracking since the hilltop in Vethmark. The mages were already there. 3 of them, standing outside the shrine's perimeter in the gray dawn light, and Sable identified all 3 by their harmonic signatures before she had clearly seen their faces. The cartographer, recognizable by the broad shallow frequency of his operational style, the 5th mage, the irregular one whose signature had always suggested less skill and more anxiety than the others, and the 6th, the oldest conduit's operator, the one who had been planning this longest. They had anticipated the approach. They had not anticipated her. She walked to the shrine's entrance and stopped and looked at them across the low moss-covered walls, and she named them. Not their operational designations from her private map notation. Their names, the actual names of 3 individuals who had been operating in the belief that anonymity was protection, that the particular invisibility of underground work meant they could not be known by anyone working from the surface. She named the cartographer, Mage Torvin of the Vethmark Border Administration's Eastern Office. She named the 5th, an apprentice named Kale, no house designation, recruited 18 months ago based on his specific frequency sensitivity. She named the 6th, a woman named Hara who had been running the oldest conduit for 3.5 years, and whose signature Sable had identified from its unusual depth and its characteristic pattern of careful, methodical extraction. She said their names at normal conversational volume in the gray morning air and watched the specific, visceral impact of being known travel across all 3 faces simultaneously. There was a moment of absolute stillness. Then Hara took a step backward. Then the cartographer, Torvin, looked at the 2 soldiers flanking Sable and at Aldren standing to her right and performed the rapid calculation of someone assessing odds and arriving at a clear conclusion. He spoke briefly to the others in an undertone. The apprentice looked sick. Hara had already retreated 2 more steps. They left. Not fleeing, retreating with the careful, considered speed of people who had determined that their operational value depended on not being detained, and who understood that being named was already a form of capture more complete than anything the 2 soldiers could have physically accomplished. Davin moved to follow. Aldren's hand came up briefly and Davin stopped. The soldiers held their positions. The 3 mages disappeared into the gray morning, and the information of who they were, documented in Perrin's survey log and carried in Sable's complete and precise memory, went with them. There would be time for the rest of it. There was not time now. Sable stepped into the shrine. The amplification hit her immediately, not painfully, but with the force of something that had been building for 3.5 years and was now, in the presence of the frequency that could disrupt it, vibrating at a pitch that she felt in every bone. She crossed to the central stone and knelt and pressed both palms flat to its surface, and the network poured into her all at once. She had held pieces of it. She had held the full map in her mind across 2 years of incremental mapping. She had never held the living network simultaneously at full depth, all 7 signatures, all the damage, all the extraction, all the accumulated wrongness of 3.5 years of deliberate assault on a living kingdom's geological foundation. It was like standing in the center of 7 voices screaming at once. She breathed. She found the space between the screaming voices and she went into it. The way she had always gone into the spaces between things, carefully, completely, without reservation. She went down through the network's surface noise, through the individual mage signatures, through the specific frequencies of damage and extraction, looking for the thing that was underneath all of them, the fundamental, the base note, the single common frequency that the entire network ran on, the architectural thread that connected all 7 conduits into a coordinated system rather than 7 separate operations. She found it at a depth she had never accessed before. It was very low, very old, not the mage's frequency, something older that they had found and exploited, a natural resonance in the geological substrate of this specific location, a frequency that the shrine's builders had known about 300 years ago and had built around because they understood that some frequencies were sacred not in the religious sense, but in the structural one, fundamental to the coherence of the land above them. She held it. She listened to it until she understood its precise character, every harmonic, every overtone, every quality of its particular note in the specific acoustic space of the deep earth. Then she sang. She had not known she would do it aloud until the moment she did, the disrupting frequency arriving not as an internal intention, but as a sound that came up through her from the central stone and out through her throat into the morning air. A low resonant tone that was neither pleasant nor unpleasant, but simply precisely, exactly, unavoidably itself. The correct note, the inverse of the fundamental. The sound that said to everything built on that foundation, this ends now. The network collapsed. It did not collapse dramatically, with the sudden violence of a structure failing all at once. It collapsed the way bad things ended when the thing sustaining them was removed, gradually at first, then completely. She felt each conduit go silent in sequence, not randomly, but in order of depth, the deepest first. The fundamental going silent beneath all of them, and everything built on it losing its coherence and dissolving back into the ordinary. Neutral, undirected frequencies of undamaged earth. The seventh conduit was last. When it went silent, the change in the frequency field was so complete and so sudden that the contrast was physical. The absence of the screaming was louder for a moment than the screaming had been. The way silence after a sustained noise contained the shape of what it replaced. She felt the shrine's amplification frequency change. It was still there. The ancient stone's resonance was not something that could be dismantled by the removal of what had been exploiting it. But it sounded different now, without the network running through it. It sounded like what it had originally been. It sounded like the land breathing. She became aware that she was no longer upright. She had slid from kneeling to sitting at some point during the process. Her back against the central stone, her palms still flat to its surface. The morning light coming into the roofless shrine at a different angle than when she had entered it, which meant time had passed that she had not experienced as time. She was very cold. She heard her name. Not a question, not a summons. Her name spoken at close range in a voice she recognized with the specific, bone-level recognition of something her body had been orienting toward for longer than she had been willing to admit. Spoken with an urgency that was not performed and not managed, but simply present. The urgency of a person who needed to know that someone they were responsible for was still there. She opened her eyes. Aldren was kneeling beside her on the shrine's ancient floor, his hands not touching her but positioned as though they wanted to, hovering at the distance of someone who had not been given permission and was not going to take it without asking. Around them, in the gray morning light, the moss on the shrine's walls had turned green. Not the gray-green of extended obscurity. Green, vivid, living. The specific color of something that had been waiting under a weight and had just felt the weight lift. Outside the shrine's low walls, in the collapsed fields along the road, nothing had changed yet. Recovery would take months, seasons, perhaps years in the most damaged regions. The land did not heal at the speed of the wound's removal. It healed at its own speed, the way all living things healed, by the slow accretion of what it needed in the absence of what had been destroying it. But it was silent now. The screaming had stopped. She looked at Aldren's hovering hands, and then at his face, and she said, with the specific, unguarded simplicity of someone who had just spent an indeterminate amount of time in a place below language, and had not yet fully reassembled the professional composure that normally preceded everything she said to him, "I am here." He closed his eyes for one moment. Then he sat down beside her on the ancient stone floor of the collapsed shrine, in the green moss silence of the healed amplification frequency. And they sat there together while the morning light strengthened, and Perrin made quiet notes in his survey log, and Davin and Reth stood their positions at the shrine's entrance, and the land around them began, slowly and without announcement, the long work of remembering what it had been before it was wounded. 3 days after the shrine, Sable could walk without assistance. This was her primary metric of recovery, and she applied it without sentiment. She was functional or she was not. And on the morning of the third day, she walked the length of the East Wing corridor and back without her hand on the wall and declared herself ready. The court physician, a careful beta woman named Aldis who had been assigned to her care, and who had spent 3 days in the specific professional discomfort of treating a condition she had no precedent for in any of her training, had expressed reservations. Sable had listened to the reservations attentively, and then risen from the bed and put on her clothes and informed Aldis that her observations would be documented and appreciated, and that the full court session was in 4 hours. Aldis had made a note in her medical log with the expression of someone recording a decision they disagreed with for the purposes of the record. Sable understood this and respected it. The East Wing drain point had been silent since the morning at the shrine. She felt its absence the way she felt all the network's absences now, not as relief exactly, which implied a contrast she needed to continue feeling to appreciate, but as a kind of returning spaciousness in the ambient frequency of the palace, the land's ordinary hum reasserting itself into the space the extraction had occupied. It was not recovered. It was recovering. There was a difference that mattered to her professionally and personally, and she was tracking it with the same methodical attention she had brought to tracking the damage. She walked to the full court session without escort. The chamber was the most populated she had seen it, not the working council's usual complement, but the extended court. Every senior noble and administrative official and diplomatic representative who could be assembled on 3 days' notice, which in the Five Rivers capital was a considerable number. Duke Heron's formal diplomatic delegation occupied 4 seats along the chamber's eastern side, headed by a senior envoy named Lord Patton, who had the expression of a man who had received very bad news from his intelligence networks and was managing the knowledge of it with professional rigidity. The Vethmark mages' names had reached Heron's court before the delegation arrived. Sable had made certain of this. She entered the chamber, and the sound of it, the multilayered hum of a large gathering in a high-ceilinged stone room, settled into a different register as she walked to the center floor. Not silence, not the dramatic hush of ceremony, but the specific attentive quiet of a large group of people recalibrating their attention simultaneously. She had walked into enough rooms in the past 2 weeks to have developed a working understanding of what her presence did to rooms now. She filed the information without assigning it weight and turned to face the assembled court. She did not use notes. Everything she was about to say had been living in her memory for 2 years and verified against physical evidence for 2 weeks, and there was no version of it she was going to misremember or misrepresent. And speaking from paper would have introduced a distance between herself and what she was saying that she was not willing to accept on this particular morning in this particular room. She began with the network. She described the drain system in its full technical reality: 7 conduits, specific locations and depths. 3.5 years of operation, beginning with Hara's proof-of-concept installation and scaling to full network deployment 2 years ago. She named every site. She named every mage. She named the operational relationship between the mage network and the Vethmark Duchy's border administration, documented through the coordination of the acceleration order with the timing of her field verification and the content of Duke Heron's personal letter, which she had brought and placed on the table before her. She described what the network had done to the kingdom's land, not in the Commission's careful language of probable atmospheric causation and uncertain recovery projections, but in the direct language of what she had heard and mapped and verified and ultimately silenced. The underground rivers receded. The fungal networks collapsed, the geological heartbeat strained. 43 sites of catastrophic crop failure, the sinkhole at Heron's Ford. The families who had loaded their carts and left land their families had worked for 6 generations. She described what she had done at the shrine. She described it plainly, without elevation or diminishment, as a technical account of a gift applied to a specific problem at significant personal cost, which was what it was and the only framing she was willing to apply to it. Then she stopped speaking about the technical matters, and the room felt the change in register. She spoke about being traded. She spoke about the receiving hall, the beeswax and cold stone, the administrator's 4 criteria, the document signed without a name. She did not speak about it to produce emotion in the room, though the room's emotional temperature was not her responsibility, and she observed its shift without managing it. She spoke about it because it was the foundational fact of everything that followed, the reason she had been in Vethmark to hear the network begin, the reason her map had been built across a boundary wall in 45-minute increments, the reason the kingdom's single most effective tool against its own destruction had spent 2 years in a room in a foreign duchy, waiting for someone to provide a path back. Lord Patton, the Vethmark delegation's head, had been maintaining his professional rigidity with increasing effort throughout. He opened his mouth once, between the mage network account and the trading account, with the expression of someone preparing an institutional objection. Aldren said, "Let her finish." 2 words, spoken without emphasis, from the head of the table. Patton closed his mouth. She finished. The room held what she had said for a moment in the way that rooms held things that had genuinely landed, not the performative pause of orchestrated ceremony, but the unscripted stillness of a large group of people processing something that had required them to revise something they had previously held as settled. Lord Cashin sat with his hands flat on the table looking at them. Lady Orvin of Internal Affairs had her pen in her hand and had not used it, which Sable noted as significant from a woman who documented everything as a reflex. Aldren rose. He did not speak immediately. He stood at the head of the table in the full court's assembled presence and looked at the room for a moment with the expression he wore when he had finished performing the consideration of something, and was now going to say what he had actually concluded. He said, "The Five Rivers Kingdom owes Sable of House Veneth a public accounting." He looked at the Vethmark delegation. "The non-aggression treaty with the Vethmark Duchy is hereby terminated on the grounds of demonstrated hostile action against the kingdom's land and population, coordinated through ducal administration. The duchy will be formally referred to the full Inter-Kingdom Council for investigation and accountability proceedings." Patton stood. The objection he launched was formal and detailed and competently constructed, and Aldren heard it in full, and then said, without particular heat, "The duchy's mages built a network to kill this kingdom's land over 3.5 years. The Duke sent a threat by letter 4 days ago. The treaty is terminated." Patton sat down. Aldren looked at Sable. He said, "And I owe her a personal one." The room was very still. The morning light came through the high windows at its prosecutorial angle and fell on the center floor, where she stood, and on the table, where the Duke's letter lay beside her hands, and on the 47 faces of the extended court who were looking at her with a range of expressions that ran from genuine open reckoning to the particular discomfort of people who had benefited from an order that had just been publicly named as wrong. She looked back at all of them. She did not fill the silence with reassurance or modesty, or the particular self-diminishment that the moment might, in an earlier version of herself, have seemed to call for. She simply stood in it. The light fell on her, and she let it. The first formal council session, in which Sable sat at the table, took place on a Tuesday. Not coincidentally, she had chosen Tuesday deliberately, with the same methodical intentionality she brought to everything, because Tuesday was the day the weekly administrative reports came in from the outlying districts, and the council therefore convened with current land condition data on the table alongside whatever other business was being addressed. She wanted the recovery data present in the room when she spoke. She wanted the council looking at numbers that showed the network's silence already beginning to translate into measurable improvement in groundwater levels and soil moisture in the sites nearest the shrine. Because she had learned in 2 weeks of working with this council that evidence preceded argument and argument preceded change, and the sequence could not be usefully inverted. Perrin had prepared the recovery report. It was 6 pages, precise and conservative in its projections. He had learned precision from her and had arrived at conservatism himself. The natural disposition of a careful professional who preferred to understate improvement and be proved right rather than overstate it and be proved optimistic. The numbers were good. Not triumphant. Recovery was a long and nonlinear process, and the report said so clearly. But measurable and real and moving in the correct direction. She placed it on the table when she sat down. Lord Cashin looked at her across the polished wood with the expression of a man who had spent a week revising his operational assumptions and had arrived at a position of reluctant, carefully qualified openness that had cost him something, and that he was not going to pretend had not cost him something. She respected this more than she would have respected a sudden conversion. Reluctant honesty was more durable than enthusiastic capitulation. She presented the Solaris Accord. She had named it herself 2 days before the session. Sitting at the East Wing workroom table with Corvin's manuscript open beside her and her own notes spread across the surface. And the name had arrived not from deliberate choosing, but from the manuscript's description of the Earthsong gift as a solar frequency, the deepest, most fundamental resonance of living land, the frequency that everything else was organized around. An accord built on that frequency. An accord that said, the things that have been treated as peripheral are in fact foundational. The margins are the center. The invisible is the essential. She presented 3 changes. The first, the immediate and permanent abolition of the designation-based hostage arrangement system. Not reform, not oversight, not additional procedural requirements around an existing practice. Abolition. Complete removal from the kingdom's legal architecture of any provision that permitted a person to be allocated to diplomatic arrangements on the basis of their designation and minor rank without their knowledge, their name, or their consent. She presented this not with anger, because anger was not the tool she had brought to this room, but with the specific, documented precision of someone who had prepared every counterargument in advance and had already answered all of them. When Lady Orvin raised the procedural concern about diplomatic reciprocity, how the kingdom would manage hostage arrangements that other kingdoms might still wish to conduct, Sable had 3 historical precedents ready. 2 from Ironmere's diplomatic archive, and 1 from the Sandlands inter-kingdom treaty records, all demonstrating that the practice was neither universal nor unavoidable, and that kingdoms which had abolished it had not suffered measurable diplomatic disadvantage. Orvin wrote something in her notes. The second change, the formal recognition of Earthsong and equivalent gifts as sovereign assets, to be designated in the kingdom's legal charter as protected capacities requiring active support rather than passive tolerance. This meant that a gift holder could not be removed from the kingdom, assigned to functions incompatible with their gift's operation, or denied the resources necessary to develop and apply their gift on the grounds of their designation or rank. Cashin objected on the grounds of precedent. No gift had previously been categorized as a sovereign asset, and the implications for governance structure were, he argued, potentially extensive. She agreed that the implications were extensive. She pointed to the recovery report on the table. She said, without emphasis, that extensive implications were appropriate when the thing being recognized had just prevented the permanent destruction of the kingdom's central agricultural basin, and that the appropriate response to discovering that your kingdom's most critical defensive capacity had been operating from a room in a foreign duchy for 2 years was not procedural caution but structural change. A pause settled over the table. Cashin picked up the recovery report and read 3 pages of it and set it down. He did not withdraw his objection. He said he wished it noted for the record. She said she would note it with complete accuracy and appreciated the rigor. This appeared to be an exchange that satisfied something in both of them, in the way that honest engagement between people who did not agree could sometimes satisfy something that agreement itself could not. The third change, the Landsong Monitoring Corps. She described the structure she had designed over the past week with Perrin and Corvin, a permanent body of gift holders, drawn from across the kingdom's population without regard to designation, trained in the specific application of Earthsong and equivalent land sensitivity gifts to ongoing monitoring of the kingdom's geological health. Not a commission, not an advisory body, a permanent operational corps with formal standing in the kingdom's governance structure, staffed by 14 individuals whose gifts she had already identified through consultation with Corvin's records and her own network of contacts developed during 2 weeks of being someone people sought out rather than overlooked. She had spent 2 weeks finding 14 people who had been doing what she did, listening, mapping, knowing things that no one had thought to ask them, in obscurity and without resources and without acknowledgement, across every corner of the kingdom. She put their names on the table. Not designations, not ranks, names. 14 names of people whose gifts the kingdom had been carrying without knowing it, held in the margin the way she had been held, doing their work in the space that was left for them, waiting without knowing they were waiting for the moment when someone who understood what they were would walk into the right room and say, "Here they are. Here is what they can do. Here is what it costs to continue pretending they are not essential." The council voted. The first change, abolition of the hostage arrangement system, passed with 7 votes in favor, 2 abstentions and Cashin's recorded objection, which she had already told Perrin to transcribe in full, because a council record that contained only the outcomes and not the dissent was a council record that had decided the future was more comfortable than the truth. The second change, sovereign asset designation for gifts, passed with 6 votes in favor and 3 abstentions. The third change, the Landsong Monitoring Corps, passed unanimously. She noted this without performing surprise, though it was perhaps the most unexpected outcome of the 3, and she understood it as the council's way of doing what large institutions did when they could not yet fully revise their foundational assumptions but could recognize, in the specific, concrete, documented form of 14 names and a recovery report and a silence drain network, that something had been working this entire time and deserved to continue working in a room where it could be seen. She gathered her papers when the session concluded. Lord Cashin remained at the table as the other council members filed out, looking at the recovery report with the expression of a man doing the specific, private work of revising something he had held for a long time. He did not speak to her. At the door he said, not to her directly but to the general air of the emptying room, in the tone of someone making an observation rather than a concession, the Omega has made herself unremovable. She was 3 paces past him, heading for the door with her papers under her arm. She heard every word. She had always heard everything. She did not pause, did not turn, did not give the comment the weight of direct response. Because it did not require her response to be true. It was simply true. In the way that facts were true regardless of the comfort level of the person observing them. And it would remain true whether or not she acknowledged it in the moment of its speaking. She walked into the corridor. The east wing drain point was silent beneath her feet. The 14 names were in Perrin's survey log and in Corvin's archive and in the council's formal record and in her own memory, where everything she had ever heard lived in permanent, exact, undiminishable detail. She went to write the letters. The eastern garden was the cleanest place in the palace. Sable had known this since her first week, had identified it through the simple, ongoing process of listening to everything beneath her feet as she moved through the palace's spaces, cataloging each area's frequency profile the way she cataloged everything, building the internal map of the palace's geological health alongside the external map of the kingdom's damage. Most of the palace grounds still carried the residual distortion of the drain network's 2-year operation, a muted flatness in the ambient frequency that would take months to clear as the land's own recovery processes gradually rebuilt what had been extracted. The eastern garden was different. It sat above an ancient spring that had been diverted underground during the palace's original construction 300 years ago, and the spring's frequency, clean, deep, continuously fed by a geological source that ran far below the drain network's operational depth, had been strong enough to resist the network's distortion and maintain its character throughout. She came here in the evenings when the day's work was done and sat in the specific quality of clean frequency the way a person sat in good light, not for any purpose beyond the simple, sustaining benefit of being in its presence. Aldren found her there on the 8th evening after the full court session. She heard him coming across the garden's flagstones with the even, deliberate pace she had learned to recognize before she had consciously registered learning it, and she did not turn from her position on the low stone bench at the garden's center, where the ancient spring ran closest to the surface and the frequency was strongest. But she was not surprised when he appeared at the bench's edge with the expression of a man who had arrived somewhere he had been working toward for some time. He carried nothing. No documentation, no administrative purpose, no apparatus of kingship. He wore the plain clothes he wore when he was not performing the role, which she had come to understand was a deliberate, considered choice rather than an accidental one, the specific signal that a man sent when he wanted to be present as himself rather than as his position. He did not sit immediately. He stood at the garden's edge and looked at the space with the particular attention he gave to things he was seeing freshly, things he had not previously taken the time to look at directly. And she understood that he was noticing the garden's quality for the first time. Not through her gift. He did not have her gift, and she had never suggested he should pretend to. But in the way of a person who had been learning, over the past weeks, to be still enough that things which had always been present but unnoticed could begin to reach him. He sat down at the other end of the bench. The garden held them both in its clean, spring-fed frequency, and the evening light came in low over the eastern wall and turned the old stone warm. And somewhere in the elder tree at the garden's corner a bird was conducting a last assessment of the day with the methodical thoroughness of a creature that took its responsibilities seriously. He said, "I have been trying to find the right way to do this for 2 weeks." She waited. He said, "I kept arriving at the same obstacle. Every formulation I found was either too administrative, too much the language of a king managing a situation, or too personally presumptuous. Too much the assumption that what happened between us in these past weeks entitled me to a kind of intimacy that I have not yet earned." He paused. "I decided this morning that the obstacle was the formulation itself. That the right thing was not to find the correct language, but to say the actual thing, and let it be insufficient if it was insufficient." She turned her head and looked at him. He met her eyes with the directness she had come to understand was his genuine mode, not the performance of honesty, which looked like honesty but was organized around the impression it produced, but the actual thing, which was quieter and less structured, and did not always know in advance how it was going to arrive. He said, I governed badly. Not in the way that kings governed badly in the histories, not through cruelty or corruption or the spectacular failures that made it into the formal record. I governed badly in the ordinary way. The way that costs more in aggregate than the spectacular failures because it happens every day and no one writes it down. I made decisions about people I had not looked at. I signed documents that did not contain names. I trusted the Commission's conclusions because trusting expert conclusions was correct practice, and I used correct practice as a reason not to look more carefully at what those conclusions were replacing. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the elder tree. He said, You were in Vethmark for 2 years because I did not look up. He said it without the hedging language of someone distributing the blame across a system, not the passive construction of things happened or processes produced this outcome, but the direct, unqualified subject-verb-object of personal accountability. I did not look up. I am telling you this not because it changes what happened, but because you named it clearly in the court session, and I want to name it clearly here, between us, with no one else in the room. She absorbed this in the way she absorbed accurate information, completely, without immediately doing anything with it, simply receiving it as true and allowing it to take its place in the full picture. She said, I know you know that. I knew it when you said my name alone in the council chamber. Something shifted in his expression. She continued, I am not waiting for you to prove you understand what happened. I understood that you understood it from the moment you pulled the hostage file the same afternoon I presented the map. The question I have been sitting with is not whether you comprehend what was done. She paused and looked at the garden around them, at the clean frequency rising from the ancient spring, at the elder tree conducting its evening business, at the evening light making old stone look like it had always been this warm. The question is what you want to build from here. He turned toward her on the bench, the full turn of a person who was done with the peripheral angle and needed the direct one. He said, I want to build something I have never built before. Governance that knows the names of the people it concerns before it signs anything that affects them. Decisions made in the presence of the people they are about rather than in their absence. He paused. And I want to do that with you specifically. Not because you saved the kingdom, though you did. Not because the accord passes everything correctly through the council, though it does. Because you are the most honest person I have been in a room with in 15 years of being in rooms. And I have been finding, since you arrived in my council chamber with your map, that I have no interest in returning to rooms where that quality is absent. The garden was very quiet. The spring moved somewhere below the flagstones, clean and continuous and entirely itself, unchanged by the network's damage because it ran too deep to reach. She placed her right hand flat on the flagstone between them. She said, Put your hand here. He placed his hand flat on the stone beside hers, their fingers not touching, both palms pressed to the ancient flag above the buried spring. She said, Now be still. He was still. She watched him be still, the specific quality of stillness she had been teaching. Not the stillness of waiting for something to happen, but the active, receptive stillness of a person making themselves available to information that existed below the threshold of ordinary attention. She had shown him this twice before, in the fields, and each time the stillness had been more genuine, more practiced, more like the real thing, and less like the imitation of the real thing. After a long moment, without opening his eyes, he said, There is something there. She said, Yes. He said, It is very deep. She said, It has been there for 300 years. It ran too deep for the network to reach it. She paused. Some things do. He opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression that had no performance in it at all. Nothing managed, nothing calibrated. Simply the face of a man in the presence of something that mattered to him and who was not going to look away from it. She looked back at him with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, complete, honest, unhurried. She said, I am not forgiving the past tonight. That is a longer work and it moves at its own pace, and I will not perform it before it is real. But I am telling you that the question I was sitting with, what to build from here, I have an answer to. He waited. She turned her hand over on the flagstone, so her palm faced upward. An offering. A question. The precise, unambiguous gesture of someone who had spent 2 years mapping things from a distance and had decided, in this garden, above this ancient spring, that she was done with distance as a primary mode. He took her hand. The garden was warm and clean, and the spring ran beneath them, and the elder tree concluded its evening assessment and fell quiet. And the frequency of the place, deep and old, and entirely itself, unchanged by anything that had tried to diminish it, rose through the flagstones into both their hands simultaneously. The land speaking in its oldest, most honest register to two people who were, for the first time, both present enough to receive it. 2 years after the shrine, the Five Rivers Kingdom was learning to remember what it sounded like when it was whole. Sable heard it every morning. She rose before the palace stirred, as she had always risen, before the day acquired its human noise. And she walked the eastern garden in the early gray light with her boots off and her gift fully open. And the land's frequency rose through the soles of her feet, and she listened to it the way she had listened to everything that mattered. Completely, without reservation, with the full depth of attention that the thing deserved. What she heard now was different from what she had heard in her first weeks back in the capital. Different even from what she had heard in the months immediately following the shrine. The distortion was mostly gone. The flatness left by 2 years of extraction had been replaced, gradually and unevenly and exactly as she had projected, by the return of the land's own harmonic, the deep, complex, multilayered frequency of a living geological system operating without interference, the underground rivers finding their levels, the fungal networks reconnecting across the distances the damage had severed, the ancient spring below the eastern garden running at full pressure for the first time in 3.5 years. The land was not healed. It was healing. There was a difference, and she tracked it with the same precision she had brought to tracking the damage, because the process of healing was as important to understand as the process of harm, and because the 14 members of the Landsong Monitoring Corps were learning from her documentation of the recovery as much as they had learned from her documentation of the assault. The Corps had been operational for 18 months. She walked through the academy building that occupied the eastern wing of the palace's outer grounds, a complex of workrooms and archive spaces, and a practice garden that had been built to her specification and Corvin's consultation. Using the archivist's 40 years of accumulated knowledge about what gift holders actually needed as its foundational brief, rather than what administrators imagined they needed, which had produced a building that was warmer and less formal and considerably more useful than anything the palace's master architect had initially proposed. 14 desks. 14 sets of survey instruments calibrated to individual gift sensitivities. A common room with a long table and a kitchen, because she had learned in her own experience that the quality of work produced in a space was directly related to whether the people working in it had been fed. The core members were not all Omegas. This had been, in retrospect, the detail that had surprised the council most when she presented the 14 names. 3 of the 14 were Beta, 2 were Alpha. All of them gift holders whose capacity to hear the land's frequency had been operating quietly in the margins of their lives, unexplained and unacknowledged for years. 1, a Beta man named Orith from the Southern River District, had been self-medicating for what the local physician had diagnosed as auditory disturbances for 6 years. He had stopped the medication on his second week with the Corps when he understood for the first time that what he was hearing was not a symptom but a skill. She thought about the physician in Vethmark and his sedatives and the 2 years she had spent refusing them. And she thought about the 6 years of Oritha's life that had been spent in the wrong relationship with his own gift. And she added both to the ongoing account she kept of what the old order had cost. Not to sustain bitterness, she had never found bitterness a useful fuel, but because accurate accounting mattered and the cost needed to be known. The hostage arrangement law had been formally abolished 8 months after the Accord's passage. The abolition had generated diplomatic friction with 2 of the 5 inter-kingdom partners, both of which had existing hostage arrangements they were required to renegotiate. The renegotiations had been completed. The friction had subsided. The world had not ended, which Sable noted with the specific satisfaction of someone who had been told repeatedly that the world would end if a particular thing was changed and had been correct in her assessment that it would not. The Interkingdom Council's investigation of the Vethmark Duchy had concluded 6 months ago with a formal determination of hostile action and a reparations framework that included a significant contribution to the Landsong Monitoring Corps' operational funding. Duke Heron had been replaced by his younger sister, who had sent Sable a formal letter of acknowledgement that was 3 pages long and contained, in its second page, a paragraph about the duchy's own land sensitivity gift tradition that had been suppressed for 2 generations and that she intended to revive. Sable had written back the same day. She walked into the practice garden as the light strengthened, the dew still heavy on the grass. The ancient spring's frequency rising through the ground with its characteristic clean depth. And she stood for a moment simply listening to the full harmonic of the morning, the palace above the spring, the core building to the east, the capital city beyond the wall, the recovering fields in every direction, the underground rivers at their proper levels, the deep geological heartbeat steady and unhurried, and entirely itself. She heard footsteps on the garden path behind her. Aldren's pace, even and deliberate, unhurried. He had been walking this garden with her in the early mornings for 14 months now. And he had been placing his hands on the flagstones each morning since the evening of the Eastern Garden in the way she had shown him, not to perform the practice, but because he had found, in the specific stillness of it, something he had not known he was missing, and was not willing to give up now that he had located it. He could not hear what she heard. He had accepted this without resistance and without the particular male impatience for rapid acquisition that she had half expected and had been wrong to expect. He was learning to be still. He was learning what stillness cost and what it offered. It was a longer education than any she could have planned for him, and he was conducting it with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. He came to stand beside her in the practice garden's center. For a while they were both quiet, in the way they had learned to be quiet together. Not the managed silence of people avoiding a subject, but the inhabited silence of 2 people who had found that being present in the same space without filling it was its own form of communication, more honest than most. Then he placed his hand on the grass beside her feet. She watched him be still. After a long moment he said, without looking up, with the quiet wondering attention of someone making contact with something larger than themselves, "It is different today." She said, "Yes." He said, "Stronger?" She said, "Fuller." Stronger implies it was weak before. It was damaged. This is what it sounds like when it is not damaged. He lifted his hand from the grass and stood and looked at her with the expression she had learned to read as his most honest one, the expression he wore when something had reached him genuinely, when the information had bypassed the governance apparatus and landed directly in the person underneath it. He said, "What does it sound like? Describe it." She considered this. She looked at the practice garden, at the dew on the grass catching the early light, at the core building where 2 members had arrived early and were already at their desks, at the elder tree that had been growing in the Eastern Garden's corner for longer than the palace had been standing, and was this morning putting out the first green of the season with the unhurried confidence of something that had never doubted its own continuity. She said, "It sounds like a very old conversation between things that have been talking to each other for longer than any of us have been listening." She paused. "It sounds like water finding its way to where it was always going. Like roots remembering which direction the light is. Like the specific frequency of something that was broken understanding, slowly and without drama, that it is not broken anymore." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "That sounds like something worth protecting." She said, "It is." He took her hand. Not the formal gesture of a king making a public declaration. Not the careful propriety of a man navigating the protocols of his position. Simply the natural, unhurried movement of a person reaching for the hand of someone standing beside them in a garden at dawn, because that was where the hand was and where it belonged. She let him hold it. The Landsong Monitoring Corps would convene its monthly full review in 2 hours. The Interkingdom Charter's 3rd annual revision session was scheduled for the following week, at which Sable would present the Corps' recovery data alongside 3 proposed amendments to the gift recognition provisions that she and Corvin had been refining for 6 months. The elder tree was putting out new green. The spring was running clean. The 14 names on the council record were 14 people at 14 desks doing work that would have been done in margins and obscurity and silence in the world as it had been, doing it now in a building designed for the purpose, with resources and recognition, and the formal standing of a body that the kingdom had determined was essential rather than peripheral. Lord Cashin attended the monthly review meetings. He sat at the back of the room and made notes and had not, in 18 months of attendance, said anything that was not genuinely useful, which Sable credited to the combination of the recovery report and his own private reckoning, the contents of which she did not know and did not ask about because a person's internal revision was their own, and the evidence of it was what mattered rather than the account. The morning light came fully over the eastern wall and fell into the practice garden in the broad, even, unhurried way of early spring light that had decided there was no reason to be anything other than what it was. Sable stood in it with her hand in Aldren and her feet on the healing ground and her gift open to everything the land was saying, which was a great deal, and which she was, as she had always been, as she would always be, listening to completely. The kingdom's song was returning. It was not the song it had been before the damage. Recovery never produced exact restoration. It produced something that had survived and knew it had survived and carried that knowledge in its frequency. A depth and a complexity and a hard-won resonance that undamaged things did not possess. She thought that was, on balance, a more interesting song. She thought her mother would have agreed. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.